To me, the soul of Shabbat, and that's what it takes, preparation and being with people. The soul is this opportunity to, number one, know that you are worthy without productivity. So you know that you have ultimate value. So it's a day when you don't try to get anything done.
I'm Ranjor, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them. Today I'm talking to Dr. Marilyn Paul. Marilyn is the author of It's Hard to Make a Difference When You Can't Find Your Keys, and an Oasis in Time, How a Day of Rest Can Save Your Life. She is the co-founder of Bridgeway Partners, a consulting firm dedicated to using systems thinking approaches to multi-sectoral and complex organizational challenges. We spoke at the end of August 2022, and I was excited to talk to Marilyn since we've been introduced by her husband, former guest of the podcast, David Peter Straw, and my discovery of her delightful book, An Oasis in Time. Avid listeners of the podcast would know that I'm a designer by profession, but I've studied religious studies in my master's degree. I did this out of curiosity for the ways religions use design to create supportive frameworks for our lives, whether they are philosophical, social, institutional, or personal. I've been especially fascinated by the way that religions design and structure time itself through ritual and community to produce valuable experiences. Meditation, pilgrimage, and the Jewish Sabbath are all examples of wonderful ways of structuring time. In fact, it was the Sabbath that opens the door to Buddhist meditation and spirituality in my own life. And Marilyn is the only person I know who wrote about it enthusiastically, pragmatically, and from an accessible, secular perspective. Her book is not just meant for Jewish people. It's a passionate defense and advocacy for the value of a weekly day of rest, a day intentionally and deeply separated from the mundane concerns of work, money, and achievement. And it's also a practical guide for how to set such a day up and embark on a journey of making it richer, more beautiful, more meaningful, and more social over time. The conversation was delightful and thought-provoking. We talked about what it was like to grow up with two therapist parents, her early interest in climate change and how it shaped her choices, suffering from what she calls chronic disorganization, and how she learned to tame chaos and to be more organized, the spirituality of organizing, the role of meditation in her journey, how she discovered the Sabbath and recognized its importance in her life, what the Sabbath has to do with gratefulness, how to remember who we are as human beings, and many other topics. We live in a hectic modern society, but I found that having a day of rest helps me stay sane and stable throughout it all. It helps me stay connected to my own values and to the present, even in the most stressful times. This conversation was a chance to enrich this day of rest. What stayed with me is Marilyn's call to make it richer, mark it more decisively, and enjoy great food and great company. It's a lifelong process, but I'm learning. This conversation is one of a dozen or so weekly conversations we already have lined up for you with thinkers, designers, makers, authors, and activists who are working to change our world for the better. So follow this podcast on your favorite podcasting app or head over to remakepod.org to find links to those apps and subscribe. And now let's jump right in with Dr. Marilyn Paul. All right. I'm sitting here with Marilyn Paul. Marilyn, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. So good to be here.
I'd like to start with this question to you about the world and your experience of it these days. So, what is it like to be you in the world today?
That is such an interesting question. I think it's good to be me in the world. I am living in a beautiful place. It's generally moderately warm. We're not suffering from heat. We have good neighbors. We're in good conversations. I'm in wonderful conversations with people. We have access to food. We have access to water. And the reason I say those things, particularly the water, is we are in a severe drought here in California, and we're very careful with water. And I think the hardest thing for me is the lack of easy socializing because of COVID is spreading quite rapidly here. And even though we know it's a less intense version of COVID, and we can meet with masks, I miss the ease of a stronger daily social life.
So, as a way into the conversation, I really like to get to know the person before we dive into the subject matter. And so my question to start unpacking that is, what's something that you learned early in life that still drives or guides you today?
It's a great question. And I would say the first thing that jumped to mind is I grew up in a very tight neighborhood. We all knew each other, but we didn't just know each other. We had a shared kindergarten, like a shared preschool. We had common land. We together built a swimming pool. We had our own food co-op. We had a theater group. And this was all the same group of people who lived right in the vicinity. And what I learned is how important that is. So when I moved here, for example, evidently the neighbors didn't really know each other on our block, but now everyone does. And everyone does because we've hosted things at our house. We've made sure to meet people. We hosted singing, distant singing during the harder parts of the lockdown of COVID. We brought people together on the street, standing about 10 feet apart to sing together. It was fantastic.
Yeah. It sounds like a very warm community, which is something that a lot of us are missing, and especially we're missing during COVID.
Yes.
So you told me that you grew up with therapist parents. Was that part of the experience of growing up? How did that shape your perspective?
I grew up thinking that everyone at least tried to talk about their feelings. I grew up thinking that healing emotional difficulty, we didn't talk about trauma back then, but that everything was possible through growing ourselves. And we don't just grow ourselves in therapy, we grow ourselves in many, many different ways in connection with others. I really think that part of life is personal growth. And the word personal growth has a certain tone to it. But let's just say, as we grow and develop, early on, when I was a little kid, I thought you became a grown-up and that was the end of it. You're a grown-up. And now I see we are we keep changing. We can't stop ourselves from changing. And I think that one of the things I think is so important is to recognize that a large part of our behavior is dictated almost by childhood wounds where we just do not see reality clearly. We are deep inside childhood wounds and we don't know it. So part of our task as adults is to keep saying, oh, that's actually, I'm now operating from another time and another place. I am not in the present moment. I want to identify, all of those resentments I'm holding that feel real, that's from early hurt.
It's definitely a pattern that I think the older I get, the more I understand how much of my life has been driven by these very early memories. And so you were at a fairly young age, you became interested in climate. So
Yes.
how did that connect with that sense that things could be better? Did you approach it with that sense? Or tell me about your involvement there.
For some reason, I don't know how I came across this, but I read several books when I was about 16. And one was The Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich. The other was Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. And in that area, the late 60s, we knew everything we know now. Not everything our knowledge has expanded astronomically, but actually we knew in the late 60s that we were already heading for trouble. And
And so you had a fascinating career. You did so many different things. So you were early on a climate activist, and then consulting, organizational consulting, system thinking. You wrote and you talked about early on in your career being very disorganized. In fact, you talked about chronic disorganization. And so tell me about that, and how did you go about dealing with that? And what was what was at the root of this?
It's such an interesting question because in a way I didn't know that I was chronically disorganized for a while. I just knew I had trouble showing up on time. I had trouble finishing projects. I had trouble delivering projects on time, but I had a certain obliviousness to that as a problem. I figure, I'm doing a lot, I'm running around. And I had a very important moment with a colleague. We were working together on a very important client, and I was going to do the data collection and write up the preliminary results and get them to him in about a week and a half. And he said, no, you're not going to do that. And I said, why not? I love it. I'll do a good job. He said, yes, you're good at this, but you won't get the results in on time. And so this time will be different. I'll do it. Give me a date. I'll meet it. I said, no, I don't believe you. I don't trust you. I still remember that sinking feeling of not only his being quite direct, and he was a dear friend and colleague who just told it to me straight. And the sinking feeling I had that he was right. No matter what I said, I was not going to be able to get that data analysis in on time. And that led me to say, wait a second, I'm in change management. What do I know about change management? Now that I realize this is an important issue, what do I know that can help me? And, I tried to get help from professional organizers, and I read all the books, and they didn't help me. So what I realized, I needed to figure out a method, which I did figure out. And I started to share it with people, and then I applied it to myself. So I live a relatively organized life now. And I can be on time. I can deliver to deadline. I can do all those things. And so I wrote a book about it that then sold very well. That book is It's Hard to Make a Difference When You Can't Find Your Keys.
Yep, that's a great title. There's a couple of really interesting aspects to this book, but I want to start with the concept of chaos. So chaos is something that you deal with a lot in your other works. So how do you think of what chaos is and our relationship to chaos?
Okay. The first thing that comes to mind is the world emerged out of chaos. And a lot of our work, I think, is creating distinctions. So chaos, to me, are those often very open, very fertile moments where if we start to make some new distinctions, like early on in the Bible, God says, let there be light. And that is a distinction. And so out of chaos, we make certain distinctions that help us understand the world better. Now, in my personal life, I created chaos because I simply didn't value order. Those distinctions that I needed were not available to me. One professional organizer said, this is not so hard. Just put things back when you're done with them. And that really perplexed me. It's like, okay, but where is back? And how do I know when I'm done with them? So that what seemed so obvious and clear to her was not obvious and clear to me. And anyway, I have a rebel side, and I thought, I'm not putting things back. And I don't like tidiness, and I don't like order, and I'm not going to create it. And my mother used to say, and I came by this honestly, my mother used to say, a woman with a neat house has nothing better to do with her time. Okay, that was a very clear message. Do not waste your time creating order. And I realized that there's a point at which disorganization really impedes your ability to do the things you want to do. So there's a moderate amount of order that really helps whatever you're trying to accomplish. You can find files if you're trying to write something. You have clean pots and pans. If you're trying to cook something, you can find your clothes. They're not all on the floor.
Yeah, it's amazing how only now in my early 40s I'm beginning to pay attention to organization. It's only now that I'm beginning to realize, oh my God, it's so much less work to just put everything back and clean, as opposed to wait a couple of weeks and then it's a disaster. So you wrote about the rhythm of organizing. What does it mean? What's the rhythm of organizing?
It's sort of like the rhythm of action. When you take action, people like me with ADD and sort of like do things on the spur of the moment, you like act. But what I learned really helps is there's the preparation, the action, and completion. And if you prepare mentally or put your tools out, or if you're cooking, chefs call it mise en place. You put out what you need to cook with. So you're not scrambling at the last minute looking for the chili powder. You put it out. If you don't have it, you get it. So there's a preparation phase for action. There is the taking action, which you would like to do in as clear and focused and direct and energetic way. And then what I slowly came to understand is there is completion. And the action really isn't over until you have restored order and you can find things again. You understand what you did. It's like the after action review, only with restoring order. And then you're ready. You get to a place where you are ready to take your next action.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you also wrote about making music out of the ordinary and the spiritual aspect of organizing. I especially need that insight because I love spirituality, but I don't love organizing. So what's so spiritual about organizing?
Well, there's so many things, but one thing is, I'll tell you a teaching of one of my favorite teachers, a Buddhist teacher, Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche. And he wrote an amazing book called Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism. And he talks about the magic of being in a simple space with order in it, that is not cluttered. And you can actually feel it. When you feel what he calls drela in Tibetan, it is that feeling of space and openness and possibility. And when our spaces are cluttered, it's very hard to genuinely get that feeling. Now some people hate having a clear desk. So you have to figure out, when do you feel that spaciousness? And does it matter to you? So that's one aspect of spirituality. Another aspect that is talked a lot about is mindfulness, being present for the moment. And in my experience, all the clutter has messages for us, and they aren't nice messages. The messages are, you're lazy, or there's a pile of papers on the dining table and it says, you don't know what's in there. You don't know what's going on. I'm not saying that the papers actually speak, but we look around and say, oh, there's something out of order here, and I'm not comfortable. I'm not energized. It de-energizes us. In Jewish spirituality, there is this notion in Musar of creating order, of seder. And our teachers tell us that act of bringing order to an environment or to a relationship is a profoundly spiritual act, because it helps you connect with the essence of, in a sense, a higher power, where you're doing what God does, and what God does is keep creating order. Like the whole 6 days of creation, that is all about creating order. So that's another aspect of spirituality, different from Buddhist spirituality.
Yeah, and we spoke to Rabbi Amichai Lau Levi, and he said one of his earliest memories is like setting the table for the Shabbat in his childhood. And then the core of Jewish spirituality is called, the central text is like Shulchan Aruch, which is like the set table. And it's all about creating this order. That's something that I should definitely get more familiar with. I know Buddhism sometimes more than I know Judaism, which is the religion I grew up with. But was meditation a big part of your journey?
Well, I started meditating actually when I first got to college, when I was 17. And I was introduced to transcendental meditation, and I meditated twice a day for years. And I think it's such an important part of my journey. I still meditate. It's been off and on. But the most important thing I have learned is that my thoughts are not reality. The thought is real in that it's in your brain, but it's not real in that it's a thought. It's not material reality. And I got that from years and years and years of meditating. And that's how come I was able to get a little more organized, because I was able to look around and see I had a little bit of an insight that I was creating my mess. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but I always had the feeling like the mess appeared. It just, why is it messy around here? I don't know where all these dishes come from. I really had that feeling of lack of ownership of the dish problem.
Yeah, no, it's definitely something I can identify with. I think when I first lived on my own, that's when I started realizing that the dishes pile up when you don't do them. I was 19, living in an apartment with my girlfriend. It was just like disgusting. It was like the dishes were overflowing. So my solution was a very maybe masculine solution, which was I will only have one plate in the house, so I have to wash it every time before I use it, so that way so I don't have nice dishes.
That solution.
Yeah, I only have one of each, or now two, so that I can host someone. But I only used one. So the Shabbat or the Sabbath is a big part of your life, and you weren't always involved with Judaism. You didn't discover it from a religious background necessarily. How did you discover the Sabbath, and what was the experience like?
I first I want to say something though about housework, and then we'll go back to Sabbath.
Sure.
I feel like I was raised by a woman, a feminist woman, who essentially said, women are empowered. We have to take power. We have to show up in the workplace. That's who we are. And housework just doesn't have that much value. And so I grew up in a cluttered, uncomfortable home. And if I wanted to cook, the spices were all over the place. She was like me, sort of ADD, or I was like her. And I have come to believe, and this relates to the Shabbat, that creating a sense of home is our most important work, actually. Not innovating or creating that's all very, very important. But I feel like it's very important for each of us to have a sense of home, a place to land, a place to reflect, a place to feel comfortable in our body, that starts in our body and then in our space. And if you don't do your dishes or don't hang up your clothes or don't put things away, it's uncomfortable. You can adjust to it. And some people say, well, my creativity is in my mess. Okay, fine, but mine wasn't. I wasn't more creative because I was messy. I thought so, but it's just, I'm much more creative now that I have a little more order. To me, what that has to do with Shabbat is there is a day a week that I prepare for. So Friday afternoon, sometimes Friday, sometimes Thursday, I prepare by knowing I am going to stop. I'm going to stop moving. And if I'm going to stop, I want to stop in a place that feels spacious. Part of what the work stoppage, the shvita of Shabbat, is it's a work stoppage. It's like going on strike. But when you go on strike in that way, you open yourself up to the marvels, the awe of the world. We can't be in touch with awe all the time, I think. That's what I think. Other people don't agree. But now we're going to prepare ourselves to recognize how glorious the world is that we live in. And that takes preparation and space.
You're listening to Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. If you're listening on a podcast app, you already know how to follow podcasts. So please follow this one. If you're listening in a browser, just go to remakepod.org to find links to all the major podcast players where you can follow our show. Before we dive deeper, because I do want to really dive deeper, but I'm curious how you discovered this and became interested in this as someone who was secular and an organizational consultant, a workaholic. How did you discover this?
I was invited by a friend to a Shabbat dinner. I knew Jews had Shabbat dinners. And I was at Yale in graduate school. I'd actually become quite sick. I could not keep up with my work. I had been working all the time, and I still worked all the time, just sort of like at half speed. The minute I had any energy, I would try to get work done. And my friend Mark invited me to Shabbat dinner. And I thought, I can't do that. I have work to do. I turned him down. I turned him down several times, but he kept asking. So I thought, okay, I'm going to give this guy a break. I'm going to go, and then I'll just come back and keep working on my dissertation. But something quite profound happened to me at that dinner, which was one, people seemed very relaxed. And they were singing songs. I didn't know the songs. I knew Jews lit candles. I didn't know the blessing. And I remember the joy in the room. There was this feeling of lightness and friendliness. No one was talking about work, which I had not experienced. Like at Yale, people aren't just talking about work, but they're also telling you what good work they're doing. And then you have to tell them what good work you're doing, and none of that. And so I experienced in that moment that spaciousness and time and connectedness. I didn't know any of the blessings. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew it was something good. But I said goodnight and went back home and worked on my dissertation. I had no concept at the time of Shabbat, but I went back the next month. And I came up with the revolutionary idea of taking all of Friday night off. So I wouldn't try to go back home and work. I'd take the whole evening off. And it was so refreshing and rewarding that I then, with the help of some friends, I decided to take Saturday morning off, not the whole morning, just till 10 o'clock. Which was phenomenal. I didn't have to think about work until 10. And little by little in that way, I pushed it to Shabbat lunch. I had people to have Shabbat lunch with. Now this took over a year. And finally, it seemed sort of out of my hands at that point. I took a day off, and not in a orthodox way, but just in a way of saying, this day is a different kind of day. Along the way, I learned that what's called remembering the Sabbath, Shomer Shabbat, keep the Sabbath, was one of the 10 commandments. And I thought, if it's up there, if it's in the same list as thou shalt not murder, it's got to be important. Once I got started, I found that my life changed completely, that I needed that day for friendship and reflection and good food. And I needed the preparation time and the fun. It's very fun to do this with people. Then I met my husband, who grew up in an Orthodox home and was like, I do not keep Shabbat. So we fought about that for a couple of years, but now we do. And our son grew up with Shabbat. Anyway. Wow. It's a spiritual journey to create this kind of space.
Yeah. And your husband, we should mention, is a former guest of the podcast too, David Peter Straw.
Yes.
And so I want to share my experience with Shabbat because I think it's very similar to yours, and maybe will be an interesting kind of opening for a conversation. I grew up secular in Israel, which has a lot of Shabbat-related rules, like no public transportation and stores are closed. Yeah. And so we kind of rebel against it as secular people because we just, we want to go somewhere and we can't because there's the public transportation are not running. And I don't think we get it. As secular people, we're not taught about the Sabbath. And so I ended up dating, when I was in New York, I ended up dating someone who's a little bit more traditional than me and came from a religious family. And she told me how much she loved spending the Sabbath with her religious family. And that didn't compute for me at all. I was like, what's to love? It's just a bunch of stuff you're not supposed to do. It's just a bunch of restrictions. What could you possibly love about that? And she said, it's not about the restrictions. The restrictions are there to create space. And what arises in that space is what I love.
Yes, that's so beautiful.
Yeah. And so I immediately became interested. So I was curious enough to try my own secular Sabbath. And I had a simple rule. I could do anything that's not productive. I couldn't do any productive things during Saturday. And for me, it was a revelation. I think you speak about it much more in detail, and you have a much deeper understanding of how to construct it. I just came in and said, if I'm doing it for some faraway purpose, like if I read a book for work, not on Saturday. If I need to do something for school, not on a Saturday. And what came in instead is I ended up taking a book that I actually wanted to read and go to the park and read it there and think about life and re-examine where I want to be in this life. And I still do it to this day. It's definitely one of the most valuable changes that I made. But when I read An Oasis in Time, it made me think that I didn't tap into the full potential. I have one restriction, basically, but I don't do any planning or preparation. And so when I read this, so you talk about this description of a man walking in the desert and, thirsty for water. And then there's this oasis. And then you say, well, you could just drink some water and move on, or you could spend an evening there, or you can spend a whole day there, like a night and a day. And the description made me tear up. I mean, it's such a beautiful description of rest. You say you sleep a long and peaceful sleep. You don't have to get on the road at dawn. You luxuriate in the spaciousness of the morning. There's no packing up, no hustling. It's just a beautiful description. Let's start with the book. So you said the soul of Shabbat, and you also, I heard you describe Shabbat like a gorgeous ship that's covered in barnacles. So you get, there's all these rules and practices that hide the soul. So what is the soul, you think?
To me, the soul of Shabbat, and that's it takes preparation and being with people. The soul is this opportunity to, number one, know that you are worthy without productivity. So you know that you have ultimate value. So it's a day when you don't try to get anything done. But not only that, it's a day to connect with people. It's a day to savor this gorgeous planet that we live on. So the soul is treasuring, savoring, knowing that you're worthy, saying thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you to whatever forces you like to say thank you to. I think there are moments on Shabbat when I just grasp that nothing needs to be done. Nothing. As big of a mess as we have made of our gorgeous planet, just for a day, we are here to be grateful. And it's very hard to be grateful and mindful when you're in a rush or trying to get something done.
Yeah, there's this division of doing versus being that people talk about. And it's when you're doing, you're focused on what needs to be different, right? And so taking a break from that to focus on what doesn't need to be different is very interesting.
It reminds me there is wonderful research that was done at the Princeton Theological Seminary. And in brief, it was theological students who were going to give a talk on the Good Samaritan, the one who showed kindness to someone who was on the road hurt. What they found from the study is that the theological students were told, you have to give a talk, it's in this other building, and you are either on time, a little late, or in a rush. So there were 3 conditions. But what they found is the theological students who are going to be speaking about kindness, when they encountered a man who was sitting and coughing in the corridor as they were rushing to give their talk, 60% of them ignored him. So it's a wonderful classic study about the impact of rushing, even when you know better. And most of us are in a rush. Most of us feel behind. Most of us really have blinders on about being human, the humanity of the others and ourselves. So at least we get a day a week to remember, I remember the Sabbath. I remember who I am as a human being.
What do you tell people who either insist that they don't have time to take off or think it's, you must be very privileged to be able to take a day off a week because we have more work than you? What do you tell these people?
Well, I say to people a couple of things. I think it's true. I think I do have some economic privilege. Some people really do have to labor for money 7 days a week or 6 or 7 days a week. And that is a reality. And I also say that cultivating an hour or two a week, an oasis in time, where you learn to set a boundary. One of the things I talk about are these 5 gateways. And one of the gateways is you name a beginning and an end. Most people I talk to think the idea of a day of not working a week is almost laughable, yet in context. So there are people at all economic levels in Israel. I talked to a taxi driver about this. He says he doesn't work on Shabbat. He just doesn't. They don't have much income, but what they do have in Israel is a framework. We don't have a framework here. And it's a form of freedom that needs support and needs to be cultivated. We really value constant productivity, even though it's sort of a lie. There's a lot of research on how much can you actually, quote, get done in a day. And often people say 4 hours is a good number. The rest of it is sort of slowing down, catching up, being distracted. It's a classic thing to say. The Romans thought that the Hebrews were crazy to take a day off a week. But anyway, the Romans didn't like the Hebrews generally. There's the quote from Ahad I think, it's not just the Jews have kept the Sabbath has kept the Jews. And I think it's because stopping gives us enormous power. That could be a controversial statement in this world, but I mean, any human being who stops gets power.
Yeah.
I think that what Shabbat gives us is, number one, a chance to disconnect from the world of work and to connect with others, to deliberately connect with other people and also deliberately connect with self. Ways of connecting with others that don't include work. We want that. We want community. And I think the food part is important. It doesn't require lots of preparation, but thinking about it, like a good place to get good hummus and good bread and maybe local seasonal vegetables and make one dish. So I find much as I love to cook, I have to make sure I'm only making one dish and the rest of it, for example, yesterday it's tomato season, amazing tomatoes, amazing mozzarella, amazing basil, and we had this gorgeous caprese salad. So simple.
Nice.
And so planning for that and then planning for luxurious downtime and luxurious time in nature. And, in the 5 gateways, I talk about begin and end. And if it's too long for you, end it early. Let's take charge of this oasis time so we really do it in a way that nourishes.
So I think there's a benefit to planning, and you have this start ritual and then an end point, an end ritual. How do you kind of bookend the day?
Well, one of the things I learned, because I talked to so many people in preparation for the book, is that having a ritual to begin, so we light candles, and we do a number of things. We start with sounding a tone from a prayer bowl, a Buddhist prayer bowl. So there's a tone. Then we say deep breath, neshima amoka. We're going to take a deep breath here and remind ourselves the week is over. That's part of our beginning ritual. And then we all say, whoever's there, Shabbat Shalom, a hug. We do for people elbows instead of hugs.
Yeah.
And in that moment, deliberately say, the week is over. It actually is over. We're in a new moment, but it really helps to say, whatever I was worrying about, it's out of my hands because I'm not addressing it. And it's still true that some days I say, okay, we'll start Shabbat and I'll go back. I'll finish something I'm working. Just this once, I'll go back, finish what I was working on. It feels so pressing. And I never do, because there's something about that ritual that interrupts the worry and gives me perspective. And then the meal we have has blessings and wine. And so within an hour or two, we're pretty relaxed. And then the end, we used to say Havdalah. We would pull out our Havdalah candle. But we often end before the end, the literal 24 hours or 25 hours of Shabbat. But we always say a phrase and sort of a gratitude for the time, like Hamavdil ben Kodesh Lekol, to make the distinction between the holy and the secular, and then receive the benefits of the rest, like consciously saying, wow, that was good rest.
Yeah, I think by adding some of these structures, a little bit of planning, and also think of it as a design project to design this day of rest.
The thing is, you're going to get another Shabbat next week. So I love bringing the designing mind to Shabbat. Say, well, this week, I'm prototyping this. I'm going to try inviting this type of person and serving this type of food. Let's see how that goes. Let's see if it pleases them and me. Let's see if that worked. That didn't work. Why didn't it work? We do some learning and reflection. And I think that's key to making Shabbat work, is we're going to learn how to do this.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an important addition. So what's the Green Sabbath Project?
The Green Sabbath Project, I ran into it a couple years ago, and it is a group of people who are exploring how observing a Sabbath, and it's an interfaith group, Shabbat, Sabbath, can really bring us closer to the planet. And they're getting together actually periodically online to support each other with this idea of doing less, having less impact, at least a day a week. And I love being part of it. It's an open invitation for people to join in and come to meetings, be part of this idea of this interfaith exploration of Shabbat.
And so does it necessitate going off the grid during the Sabbath and no electricity, or what's the range of practices that they would support?
That is such a great question. The idea is, so one, there's a range. You could go off the grid, you could decide not to travel, but I think a lot of the idea is to pay attention to slowing yourself down, making more conscious choices, whatever you do, and celebrate. Shabbat is a holiday, so making music, coming together, celebrating, so that we know more and more that eating, feasting, celebrating, dancing, making music, all of these are very nourishing activities that we can do every week. Have fun, have a good time, and don't be so hard on the planet. Don't use so much carbon. Don't waste food so much. Don't buy so much. Don't throw out so much. We can get our joys in non-materialistic ways. And this is something the Green Sabbath Project is helping us see we can do quite regularly.
Interesting. So for the closing question, this is a recurring question. In his TED Talk, a philosopher, Alain de Botton, talks about the difference between a lecture and a sermon. A lecture being a dry, factual, modern way of delivering information where you have to make up your own mind. And a sermon, which he really longs for, is a more urgent plea to change your life, grabbing someone by the collar and saying, you should do X. And so my question to you is, if you had a chance to give a short sermon, what would it be about?
Well, what I would say is we've been snookered, people. We have been taught that productivity is the way to satisfaction and a great life. And if we can only do more and even be more and go faster and be stronger and be better, life would get better. And that's wrong. And the challenge is it's partly right. And so we're snookered by the part rightness of it. Yes, it feels good to accomplish. Yes, it feels good to achieve. Yes, it feels fantastic to make our various accomplishments available to the world. But we can live in rhythm. So we can have all of that part of the week, and then we put it away. We put it in perspective, and we turn to a day of soul life, a day of connection, a day of receiving and giving at a totally different level. And that is the level of heart, of spirit, of love, of connectedness, and of trust.
Thank you very much, Marilyn. I appreciate your time today.
It's great talking to you. I love it.
Remake is produced by myself and Regina Rothstein. Research and editing by Louis Brady. And audio engineering by Greg Cocoveos. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also just makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We're a global strategic design sprint agency aimed at improving outcomes through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well everyone, and see you next week on Remake.